Hello, everybody, and welcome again today. We are privileged to welcome Professor Timalsina of San Diego State University, where he is Professor of Religious Studies. He obtained his master's degree in 1991 from Sampoornananda University in Varanasi, India, and taught for several years at Nepal Sanskrit University, Kathmandu. He completed his PhD from Martin Luther University in Halle, Germany in 2005, with a focus on the history of the philosophy of Advaita. His dissertation is published under the title Seeing and Appearance, Shekhar Verlag, 2006. Before joining San Diego State University in 2005, Professor Timalsina taught at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Washington University in St. Louis. His areas of research include classical Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain literature, and philosophies with a special focus on consciousness studies. His book, Consciousness in Indian Philosophy, Routledge 2008, is a comparative study of Advaita and Buddhist understandings of the self and consciousness. Professor Timalsina also works in the area of tantric studies, and his recent publications, Tantric Visual Culture, A Cognitive Approach, Routledge 2015, and Languages of Images, Visualization and Meaning in Tantras, Peter Lang, 2015, explore the cognitive and cultural domains of tantric visualization. He has published over 40 articles, book chapters, and review essays on religion, culture, literature, aesthetics, and philosophy. He teaches courses on Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain religious, philosophical, and literary traditions, and his teaching interests include religion and science, as well as yoga, philosophy, and practice. His current areas of research include theories of mind, with a particular focus on the cognitive aspects of recognition, memory, imagination, and emotion. The subject of his talk today is Advaita philosophy of Dristisristivada. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much, Honorable Swamiji, Diane, and all seekers of Atmajnana. So it's quite a journey, and we find ourselves in this web of Maya Jala, a Zoom Maya, a connection with the external world. No thanks to Corona, we are here to share, and it's kind of interesting that I needed Swamiji to say this is a worth a topic. After I published this book, this is the first time I'm discussing this in the past 15 years, and that is a kind of very sweet for me, but also shows how we have to maybe do more to create awareness in these studies. Om Vishwam Darpana Drishyamana Nagari Tulyam Nijantargatam Pashyannatmani Mayaya Bahirivod Bhutam Yatha Nidraya Yah Sakshat Kurute Prabodha Samaye Swatmanameva Dvayam Tasmai Shri Guru Murtaye Nama Idam Shri Dakshina Murtaye. So let's first break down the word Drishti, Srishti itself, and then you know, many of us may not be familiar with these Sanskrit words. Drishti, perception or seeing, and Srishti, creation, externalization, emanation. So what is the connection of seeing or consciousness with creating, making something external to the self? And the whole issue of Advaita Vedanta roams around it, so much so that Madhusudana Saraswati, one of the most prominent Advaita Vedantin, identifies this as the Mukhya Vedanta Siddhanta, the primary or the main Vedanta thesis. Even though we have not substantially studied its history, its relationship with other models. And so we have to trace, at least in my today's brief presentation, I would like to show some nuances of the constituting Drishti Srishti. And for that, I would like to start from a very plain and simple understanding of the term Drishti, because there will be a lot of misgiving when we do not know this very term. Drishti as vision, perception, or appropriation is used mostly in Mahayana Buddhist literature for false projection. And so you cannot find there any drishti that is correct. So all the drishtis are supposed to be erased to go to that empty state of the mind. In contrast, the term drishti here is for consciousness itself. So the drishti term is used for like a sensory perception, but the modes of sensory perception, what I see, what I touch, what I hear, in all these jigran, shrinwan, like either in the mode of hearing or in the mode of smelling, it is the very consciousness that is manifest. And so the idea we need to trace back to the Upanishads, primarily Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Yadvai tanna pashyati, Pashyan vai tanna pashyati, nahi drashtur drishter vipari lopo vidyate avinashitvat, natu tad ditiyam asti tatu anyad vibhaktam pashyet. Pashyan vai. So the self or consciousness, it never is the case that it ceases to be. It never is the case that it stops being aware. And in this mode of it being self-aware, sometimes we have shadows, we have colors of the external. And how does this externality manifest inside consciousness? We have to take this conversation either purely philosophical or as contemplative, because unlike the modern day laptop philosophy, the philosophy in ancient India and Greece was for self-transformation and realization, and not just gymnastics of the mind. So we can use it both ways. What does it mean for me to have awareness? When am I conscious? Whenever I am conscious, how does my consciousness reflect something external? And is externality always given to consciousness, or how does this externality come into being? So this is where, without the use of, I'm tracing some ideas in the Upanishads that they may not be using the term Drishti Srishti, but they're actually using the philosophy. And when we read later scholars like Prakashananda, we need to keep in mind what texts are they deriving these ideas from. There is this interesting conversation between the king Ajatasattu and Balakir in the Kaushitaki Upanishad, in that the king points to a man who is sound asleep and then raises a question: what happens to the world, to this person? Where is the world for this person right now? Where is his world? So the conversation goes on to say that matram, the upasamritya, like when our eyes and ears, and they are all not functioning, what happens to the modes of consciousness flowing out through our sensory modalities, that they go back to the mind? And what happens when the mind is not dreaming or fantasizing, imagining, or remembering. What happens to the mind when the mind goes back and slips in its primordial cause, that the world as if dissolves for that person. So this is where when people make the idea, the Advaita Vedanta conversation on Drishti Srishti quickly synonymous to some idealism, we need to be mindful that at least from the perspective of both the Brihadaranyaka and the Kaushitaki, what we are talking about here is phenomenology. It's not a description of what happens to the table or the chair where the yogi is sitting while in this meditative state, or in going to deep sleep. Is the world, is his bed somehow collapsed into his mind when he's asleep? Or are we talking about what is given to his consciousness? There is no bed when you are in deep sleep state in your mind, in the horizon of your consciousness. There is no wealth or Rama, the women, or Ratha, the chariots. So nothing appears to the subject who is sound asleep. And slowly, when the subject regains consciousness, the world starts appearing. That's one easy way to connect to the idea, the Advaita idea of Drishti Srishti, that is stop describing some kind of physics. I mean, there is nothing wrong in making a Vedanta physics, but what exactly is this model discussing is epistemology and phenomenology, particularly how do we cognize things, and in the mode of cognition, how do we create reality? So for that, two different types of competing models are there. One is the, let us say, parinama, the transformation, that when you make a clay pot, the shape of the lump is changed, not the property itself, because even when you make it a pot, all the qualities of the soil that it had before are still intact, and nothing new, chemically new property has arisen in this pot. That would be parinama, or the model of transformation. Another is emergentism, and this emergentism model has been very popular these days, particularly in Western physics and chemistry, and how new properties emerge, and this leading to other models like epiphenomenology, that is something you cannot reduce back, but it's just some kind of magical, in a sense, appearance of non-existing entities. But this is the concept, like in early philosophy, in both modes, like Charvakas, who did not rely on the self or the afterlife or the Atman or anything. They also accepted the model of this type of utpatti or emergentism, and the Nyaya philosophers also accepted emergentism in a different way, of course. In the Nyaya, they have the instrumental causality of Ishvara. In Charvaka, they do not have instrumental causality of Ishvara. But what is Dristisristivada saying, or what does Dristisristi have to do in all these competing models of causality? Is practically, when we say creation, it is our vision. I'm just saying in a plain and simple word. Let us say we are calling it a lump, and then we are calling it a jar or a pot, or we are calling it, when it was just a block of gold, we are calling it gold. And then now the same gold is now drishti. We have the vision, a perception, and that makes us call it the ring or the chain or all kinds of jewelries that we convert the gold into. Not that the gold has any transformation in its intrinsic property, but it is just our perception is changed, and our appropriation is changed, and our evaluation of the entity is changed. Like someone, if automatically, turned into a king or a president, then the perception changes, that he becomes a different person. Is there a fundamental difference in this modification, or is that even a modification? And that is where Dravidacharya had one very interesting narrative to share with us. Unfortunately, his works are not available, but some citations are on there. In this narrative, he gives an example of Villa Rajakumara, a tribesman. And the story goes like that. There was a kingdom in which the king was attacked and was killed, and there was a little baby prince, and the minister was wise, and he snuck with the baby out of the kingdom and went to a forest and met one tribesman and asked him to adopt this baby and then keep in disguise, to not tell the identity for the risk of life. And then the minister goes, and the new king comes there, and slowly he starts organizing his own army, and he has all the plot to retake the kingdom. And after 18 years or so, this minister comes and meets this young prince, now handsome, and then he greets, hello prince, and this guy, raised as a tribesman, fails to recognize and rejects whatever his greetings are. And then when this minister starts explaining that he actually is the prince, he laughs, because that is very funny, because he's a tribesman. And then he says, why not we go to your dad and ask him for once? And says, agrees, and then go. And then, dad, look at this crazy man. He thinks I'm a prince, and can you tell him? And then he says, my son, but this is the truth. I could never tell you that. Now, the Advaita story is this prince who strongly convinces himself that he's a tribesman has ever actually been anything but the prince. He has always been a prince, but then he hears that he's actually a prince, and then he kind of doubts, and his behavior is still like a tribesman. But slowly he likes to, and when he accepts that this is the case, and then he changes into it. But this is not that he ever was not a prince. The same way, our convictions, our notions of whatever the reality we think of, that is what constitutes difference in our idea, but not that there has been actual difference. So now this is just a story, but think from Advaita perspective, the absolute, the Brahman. Is there any change, alteration in the Brahman as such when we assume it to be? Because when we start thinking from the perspective of Brahman, we fail to recognize this is us we are talking about. This is me, my own personal being. And when Swamiji says, you are Brahman, Sthaneshwar, I'm like, okay, give me a break. I'm just an ordinary man here. And then, but this is very difficult for us to accept. But if hypothetically we turn in to get used to this accepting our own divine nature, of myself being the Brahman, is there a new creation? Is there something new gonna happen? Am I gonna grow horn, or my ears go like pop big, or do I become invisible, or something really fantastic, like floating up in the sky, like so many yogis we heard in the stories. It would be nice though, but nothing as such is gonna happen. This is just, we recognize reality and embrace reality, or now it becomes difficult for us to embrace reality. And that is the fundamental difference between drishti, our vision, our perception as such. Little bit of brief kind of description on different models inside Advaita Vedanta, because when somebody is reading only scholastically, maybe he will fail to recognize that Advaita itself is a rich philosophy with different models within, sometimes even competing models within. And the foremost of that, I'll mention the names briefly. One would be Ajativada. This is a model attributed to Gaudapada, the grand master, I mean, traditionally speaking, the grand teacher of Adi Shankaracharya. And there are many other teachers, by the way, like Dramida or Adi Shesha, because, and then many others after Shankaracharya. One should never think that Adi Shankaracharya is the only Advaitin, like first and the last, because that type of attitude fails to recognize the Upanishadic tradition, because Shankaracharya also never mentions kind of he is the first, guy propounding Advaita Vedanta. This is more of a Indo-logical European imposition upon our history. And it's constantly rethinking and refining the ideas prevalent in the Upanishads. So that is what is happening in the Bhagavad Gita too. It's a rethinking of the philosophy of the Upanishads and Brahma Sutra, 550 or 55 sutras. It's also thinking, rethinking, organizing the philosophy of the Upanishads. And so Vedanta itself is a thinking and rethinking of what is there in the Upanishads. So Ajativada, simply put, is there is no jati, genesis, birth. You can interpret it in two different ways. One is nothing is born. That is like a, you can take it in the Madhyamaka Buddhist way, that there is nothing to be born and it's just all empty. But in here, no deviation has occurred in the absolute Brahman, pure consciousness, in the modes of creation. The fundamental issue, the questions I keep getting, even when I discuss in Trika Siddhanta and Advaita Vedanta, that whether consciousness deviates or some, if there is pulsating and it's some kind of change happening. And I keep telling that you are not going to understand one without actually understanding the other, because Advaita is the very Upanishadic description of understanding consciousness in its absolute form, and Trika Siddhanta is the very understanding of the Upanishadic thinking of the dynamism of consciousness. And so we have to try to accommodate both the ideas for us to narrow down where we are going to fit, where our personal experiences are going to fit. The second foremost model would be Abhasa, appearance Vada, Abhasa Vada, and third is a Pratibimba, or reflection. And this Abhasa Vada is always a common term in the Trika Siddhanta as well as in Advaita Vedanta. And so also is Pratibimba. So there are these minute variations when you go to doing etymology or exegesis, these how the texts kind of interpret these concepts with the exact term in slightly different way, actually giving rise to completely different philosophies. But these both terms are predominant there. And Pratibimba-vada is mostly credited to Padmapada Acharya and, Panchapadika and Prakashatma's commentary upon that. Just trace a little history there. And you also have Avachedavada, the delimitation. When we read early text like a Gaudapadakarika, for example, we find examples for Abhasa, we find examples for Avacheda, we find examples for Pratibimba. It doesn't appear like the early Advaita masters were actually making any critical difference in these models, but a post-Shankara Advaita Vedanta starts taking these models very seriously. And there is this, maybe these days, these differences do not even matter, because we are not even there to understand the critical difference between the constitution of Ishvara and Jiva, the plurality or the singularity of Jiva, or what amounts to being Ishvara, because immediately people think of Ishvara, they jump into some kind of God concept and not even ever questioning what is meant by Ishvara in Advaita Vedanta. And there is not even a single way of assigned role for Ishvara in Advaita Vedanta. That is where these Abhasa and Pratibimba models differ in ascribing the role, whether it is delimited by Maya or whether it is delimited by ignorance, avidya, or whether, so these are whether the deep sleepy states, collective consciousness is Ishvara, and these are the issues that made these models as different Advaita models. When it comes to Dristisristi, for example, Madhusudana Saraswati, where in Advaita Siddhi, there's one good chapter on Dristisristi, and he's critiquing in turn Vyasatirtha's, Madhva comment on rejection of the ideas of Dristisristi, and the next chapter goes critiquing on Ekajiva. There are a couple of things for us to take home before we go to next issue. That number one, this is not a model for, okay, let me study Advaita Vedanta. And then what we are being told is there's this absolute consciousness, unmodified, and it's non-dual, and and in its absolute form, free from differentiation. And that may be difficult to relate to for the beginners. So therefore, this is, Madhusudana says, this is not for the beginners, although this is the primary model of Advaita Vedanta. And some people have jumped into conclusion, this is because like essayist Perseppi, like Bishop Berkeley's philosophy, or this is like Yogacara exactly because Vijñapti matram evedam asadarthava vasanat yatha taimirikasya keshondrukadi darshanam. So this is like how Vasubandhu explains in the same line. One could say this whole thing is merely Vijñapti or momentary consciousness, but what we would be missing then is consciousness is not momentary here. And immediately when we say consciousness is not momentary, people impose permanence. And that is not what Advaita Vedanta, to my knowledge, is saying that either, because this consistency, inconsistency are concepts derived based on temporality. We need time consciousness to say something is permanent. We need time to say something is momentary, because it is only temporal. These concepts are temporal, either relying on time or transcending time. If you are in timeless reality, then how could you conceive of momentary things? How could you think of impermanence? And if you cannot have the concept of impermanence, how are you going to even think of permanence? How are you going to think of eternity? Eternity itself demands temporality, to have the notion of temporality. Therefore, the idea is not so much about whether consciousness is permanent or impermanent. The idea is that consciousness is the constitutive force for all the ideas, including the very notion of temporality. So how can we have the sense of temporality in absence of consciousness? We can have consciousness and not have temporality. That is like, I'm not always conscious of time. I mean, if I'm watching a show or something, I don't mind, a couple hours gone. Only when I'm reading, then or teaching, then I might think about, oh, how many minutes left? But so you see, we are not bound to have always the sense of temporality. So we cannot say that time is intrinsically inherent to consciousness, or that you cannot separate temporal awareness from consciousness. It is completely possible for me to not think about time. When I'm in deep sleep, I don't have the notion of time. Therefore, I may be for 1 hour, and if you have practiced meditation and if you have been to samadhi state, then even then you may not have any notion of temporality for the time that you are in the samadhi state, particularly if if you practice good enough, and then in the asamprajnata, non-cognitive mode of samadhi, then you have transcended mind, you have transcended the mental aspects, and then you are there. And time as if does not flow. Does time flow for outside world? I mean, that is, you are talking about physics, and we are talking about metaphysics. And when you are talking about metaphysics, we are talking about phenomenology. We are actually, what we are talking about is, how do I know what I know? And what is the real nature of me knowing myself? And how does my consciousness manifest externality or internality? How can consciousness have a horizon, a linearity in a sense, a progression from coming from the past to the future? Swami Vidyaranya in his Panchadasi therefore explains tucha anirvachaniya cha vastavi chatyado cheti asau tridha jnaya maya tribhirvedai shrauta yauktika laukikai. So from the perspective of Shruti, or the realized one, tutsa, it's fictitious. What is ignorance, or what is maya? Illusion is never existing there, never there. And if you use logic to explain our erroneous cognition, then they would say anirvachaniya, indeterminable, because it doesn't have any determinate form of what is the nature of the illusory object. We are not talking about whether there is illusion. We are not talking about the reality of the base of what appears in the mode of illusion. We are just simply talking about what is the inherent nature of the manifest entity in the mode of illusion. So this is like how the same entity, the same Maya, can manifest in so many different ways. To go further in this idea, I would like to cite Sarvagyatma Muni, another prominent disciple in the second generation, who just says, Asrayatta Vishayatta Bhagini Nirvibhaga Chitireva Kevala Purva Siddha Tamaso Hi Paschimo Nasrayo Bhavati Napi Gochara. Asrayatta Vishayatta Bhagini Nirvibhaga Chitireva Kevala. What happened? I should have given a little background there. Once Advaita Vedanta used ignorance to define the manifold. There's so many objections. You have to read Saptavida Anupapati of Ramanuja Acharya, wonderful philosopher. And there is like a really sharp objections. And what happened in the second generation, and particularly third generation of disciples of Shankara, that some adopted one model and rejected those objections. Others adopted different models. I've mentioned Sarvagyatma Muni and Vimuktatman, some of the foremost Advaitins that most people don't talk about these days. So whether ignorance is located in the absolute Brahman or ignorance located in the individual self, is individuality inherent or inherently given? Is there a beginning of ignorance? Although these questions are pointless in self-realization, Pandits always exercise these arguments. Jiva isho vishuddha chit tatha jiveshayar vida avidya tat chitor yoga sadasmakam anadaya. Madhusudana Saraswati cites this verse somewhere and then says that jiva, individuality, isha, the Ishvara, collective individuality, Vishuddha Chit, pure consciousness, Tatha Jiveshayar Vida, the difference between the individual and the fragmented form as me and the collective form as Ishvara, ignorance and the difference between ignorance and ignorance and the Brahman, these are beginningless. There is no, so but we can see tadananyatam arambana sabdadiva tasmad etasmad atmana akasha sambhuta. So we have these stories of creation, and how can you say that these are beginningless? So then the response to that is, even these narratives of beginning is not to assign beginning per se. It is only to explain that it is all one. This is Advaita, to teach oneness, that we have used that it all begins from the Brahman. Does it really begin from the Brahman? Because then you would have to say that there is actually a real beginning. But what is the real beginning? For a real beginning has to be real, and for beginning has to be real, time has to be real, space has to be real, everything spatio-temporal has to be real, and duality has to be real, and all the differences have to be fundamentally real. And if that is what is rejected in Advaita, then we have to start from rejection, and then that is where Sarvagyatman explains that nirvibhaga chiti eva kevala, only the consciousness devoid of differentiation is what is both the subject and object of avidya, that it itself assumes, becomes as if the object, like objectifies itself and becomes the subject. It is itself accepting its own objectivity and subjectivity by being the ashraya, location, and being the object as well. Why? Is because otherwise you could not consider ignorance first and then causing jiva, the subject, because being subject requires ignorance, and being ignorance requires subject who is being ignorant. So there is some kind of a conversation, if you read the text, like between Srishti Drishti and Dristisristi, other terms introduced, where what are the differences is this creation a collective creation by Ishvara consciousness? Most Advaitins accept that model, that it's not just my individual creation, but this is this collective individuality, Ishvara, that is what constitutes this common sense reality. But then if you read Vimuktatman, he adopts Eka Jiva Vada, that there is a Jiva, and of course it's not referring to Ishvara. Yeah, there is this one single Jiva. And then, but what is the Jiva then? If we were to entertain this, we can anytime go to a little bit more scholasticism, but then the idea is that jiva could be sometimes defined as a buddhi pratibimbita, the consciousness reflected in the collective mahat tattva or buddhi, intellect, or oftentimes in the avidyavachina chaitanya, consciousness that is conditioned by ignorance. And so I would give you mostly an easiest way to kind of comprehend how the relationship between Ishvara and Jiva from the Advaita perspective, because that we need to locate these ideas, vastly misunderstood these days. We are so quick to use the terminology of God. I have no objection with that, but it just causes so many misconceptions that I can give just Vidyaranya's definition, which is a very easy. Maya vachinna chaitanyam Ishvara, avidya vachinna chaitanyam Jiva. That very consciousness, the very Brahman, that very Satchit Ananda, pure being, pure consciousness, and pure bliss, when it is delimited by Maya, the illusory powers, then it is considered Ishvara. And when that very non-differentiated pure being is delimited by avidya, ignorance, then it becomes jiva. And avidya can be manifold. Sometimes people assume as many jivas, that many avidya, and then yet again we go to different type of scholastic debate over whether avidya is singular and creates duality in the individuality. The point is it is in our own core of being, in our subjectivity, that we constitute difference. And that is the first constitution guided by Dristisristi. And our problem is not with the world in reality. If you read Vedanta, our problem is also relinquishing our true nature and assuming the nature that is not ours and accepting the nature to be non-existing nature, to be our real nature, and what really is there is forgotten. In multiple different interpretations, so somebody would say Srishtau Satyam. Drishti, if there is a creation, then there is a perception, or Drishti Eva Srishti, or Srishti Samakalina Drishti. So in so many different ways, I need to also be mindful of the time I'm allowed to talk. So therefore, there are different ways to, just to tell you that there are different ways to interpret Dristisristi, whether this is a creation contemporaneous to perception, or this is just creation is only seeing only, and seeing used in the pure sense of pure consciousness. So this is, at least in these two different ways, understanding the Dristisristi is very meaningful. And I would just like to open up for questions. But before that, I would like to address one beautiful verse by Vimuktatman in his Ishta Siddhi. Ya nubhuti raja meya nantatma nanda vigraha Mahadadi Jaganmaya Chitra Vittim Namamitam Ya Anubhuti. If you know Indic languages is spoken today, Anubhuti is very much alive in conversation, our immediate experience, Anubhav. Yeah, that Anubhuti, Anubhav, that experience, but when we use the term experience, we miss that. And then let's go to the inner mode of consciousness. Yeah, Anubhuti, this inherent intrinsic mode of consciousness is a ja. There is no genesis, there is no birth of this consciousness, that whenever I am conscious of something, I become aware of heat and cold, I become aware of food and no food, I become aware of something appealing and repelling. And in these modes of consciousness, immediately I think my consciousness emerges and dissolves. And that is how we accept consciousness as having a real beginning and ending. And what Vimuktatman is saying is, wait on, just stop there. That is not really consciousness. It is already consciousness being filtered through your projection, through Maya, through avidya, and the consciousness that is pre-modified has no aja ameya, is not to be maya, to be known, to be cognized. Because when I have the experience, I have this intensity, there is intensity in my sensation. Sometimes I feel strong pain, I'm very happy, you know, so there, but consciousness is not like, there's a lot of consciousness, you know, there is a list 1 kg of consciousness. Consciousness is not something that we can measure. What is, because it's endless, boundless. And Ananda Adivigraha, it is its own form, is pure bliss. And what does it do? It is Mahadadi Jaganmaya Chitra Vittim Namamitam. This is Mahadadi, starting from Mahat or Buddhi Tattva to the entire world. This is the Viti, the background, the substrate wherein the painting in the form of the world is made. This is the canvas upon which the world emerges. And this is it's his benedictory verse, but this is more or less the whole thing of Ishta Siddhi, because he goes on explaining most of the first chapter and this in order to establish the Ekajiva doctrine. So I would like to give more time for conversation, because that way I could try to relate to reality, although I can very much say that, wait, and there is no reality outside of myself, but then that would make our whole conversation a moot point. That I do very much believe these models of Advaita as approaches to recognizing reality. And as I said before, if you read the people, Madhusudana Saraswati, who is foremost Advaita Vedantin, is also the guy who wrote, Bhagavad Bhakti Rasayana, the guy working on the Bhakti, and Prakashananda, who wrote Vedanta Muktavali, the foremost scholar, credited to be as a propounder of a Dristisristi model, himself was authored. He authored a good number of books on Sri Vidya, Tantric sadhana. So some people today are also confused. These kind of questions keep coming because they are given these as like, two type of rival ideas. They need to kind of like a ram type of fight, It's just a whole lot of modern colonial problems we face. And but anyway, I am really sincerely thankful to Honorable Swamiji for giving me this opportunity to share some of the my studies and with you, all the enlightened seekers. And I'm here to have any conversation. If you have any questions, please share with me. Thank you so much.
So the first question is from Girish. What is the difference between avidya and maya?
So it's also, again, some schools would kind of sort of use one term and then try to make it both. But fundamentally, let's go back to how does one become many? Come on, in everyday reality, we do experience the manifold. And how does that manifold come into being? So when we are considering avidya and maya as two categories, then easy way to understand would be, first of all, we would have to, hide our true nature. So if you are in theatrics and you know what I mean, then you want to put colors and things like that to start appearing, looking like a different person. That is avidya, covering. She does the avarana, avachedika, and then vikshepa, projection. Like then you reveal something that is not there. And it is the role of Maya to manifest a new reality. So first of all, avidya does the avarana, covering, and Maya does the projection. And then we go into this full encountering of a difference. That is what I would say a definition of difference between avidya and maya would be. Thank you.
And one more question from Girish. What is the role of karma or Ishvara in Dristisristivada?
When we are, number one, Ishvara is also let us say, what is the, even Ekajiva. Ekajiva is mostly aligned with Drishti Srishti. And yeah, I would cite Vimuktatman, because if I were to say these things are not there, and then, I might face a lot of questions more. So I would just simply say, what does Vimuktatman think upon this question, like about Ishvara or Guru or liberated beings? These are all fantasy stories, narratives for us to keep on going, because there is nobody coming to liberate you. Wake up, and then that's it, done. It's you wanting to be in this delusion and then creating a fantasy world in which you have the creator God. Mostly, in that, so I kept talking and talking, forgot to talk about Yoga Vasishta, because, in 1 hour, I didn't know how much I could even share. Like in Vasishta's fantasy, you create a universe and you can create gods too there, so that they can create. So this is the power of your own projection, and that in that projection, what is the status of Shrutis to you enlighten, and then is enlightenment real then? Does moksha occur? No, it doesn't, because for moksha to occur, bondage has to be real. And bondage is never real. There had never been bondage in reality. Has there ever been a real snake, even for a moment, just because you happen to see a snake in a rope? No, therefore, where are we talking from? From the perspective of the person who is actually seeing the snake, Dristisristi is useless. We have to start from Srishti Drishti. Come on, baby, this is a snake, okay, but you know what? This is a different type of snake. We can go and touch it. It is not going to harm us. Look, and then it doesn't even move, and you can feel it. And then, no, you know what? This is not a snake. But when from the perspective of the enlightened ones, we are simply rejecting. There never ever was a snake, but I saw it, and then it was there when I saw it and just went away. When I stopped seeing it, it does not go anywhere. Where does the non-existent snake go? When you realize there was no snake, what happens to that poor snake that was right there? It doesn't happen anything, nothing happens, because it was as if it was there. It was not the karma, you know. What happens to karma? As if it was there. It was never there. It's like from the perspective of Srishti Drishti, all things karma and Ishvara and our daily rituals and obligations and shrutis and smritis and our gurus and enlightened beings, all are real. And we have to act accordingly. But from the perspective, so therefore, Drishti Srishti is an analysis of the world post-enlightenment. Srishti Drishti is an analysis of the world pre-enlightenment. Therefore, that is why Madhusudana is saying that this is not for everybody, because it can, you know, make people little feel weird about it. Thank you.
The next question is from Rekha. You mentioned dynamism of consciousness. Could you please explain how consciousness can be dynamic if it is in reality unmodified and a mere witness?
Because we are assuming modification in a very spatio-temporal way, and that is how the modification is viewed in Advaita Vedanta, and that is where the modification is rejected. In my dissertation, what I try to argue, actually, this debate is not like some people have jumped into when Kashmir Shaivism came and then this idea came into being. Actually, since we do not have the philosophy of Bhartri Prapancha, we have lost a lot. This philosophy of dynamism of consciousness is the philosophy of Bhartri Prapancha. Of course, I mean, his commentaries upon the Upanishadic philosophy. And how did he view? Because there are like at least 1,000 stanzas of citation we find. That is kind of sort of a good enough citations to understand his philosophy. But to come to the question, how can there be dynamism if there is no transformation? Transformation, we are thinking in a spatio-temporal term again, but the way they are saying is assuming the manifold, assuming materiality, assuming physicality, corporeality, it itself is dynamism. And so right now, are we gonna totally negate ever having this conversation? Or are we going to say the conversation did occur? And then when we think from the perspective of dynamism, it is the very consciousness in its own inherent nature is dynamically manifesting in the mode of this dialogue, or then we would be otherwise rejecting any transformation or any dynamism. And so these are, again, I'm not going to solve this because it is going to take a lifetime to have a conversation upon these two different modes and mostly meditative states. We need more like a contemplative type of exercise. Even when we are doing philosophy, we need deep contemplation to do philosophy, to see to what extent I can see consciousness having dynamism. But the point is, we should not always be rigid about understanding dynamism only in a spatio-temporal sense. Even being in the world, freedom and a manifoldness. What if instead of some kind of ignorance tying me in this corporeality, this is my innermost thrust to assume this manifold? And we can find the Upanishads too. Tasmad va etasmad atmana akasha sambhuta. So last time I rejected that as a creation, really prescribing creation. Now we can say, no, it is actually prescribing, and it is inherent to the very Brahman to have the manifoldness. And we can find those type of shrutis too. Because at the end of the day, what we need to keep in mind is that we are trying to understand the Upanishads and we're not trying to make some random ideas. Thank you.
Is it true that Dristisristi and Ajatavada differ only in the relative domain?
Ajativada of Gaudapada is very much close to Dristisristi, but the terminology of Dristisristi came a bit later and it absorbs many similar ideas. In the time of Gaudapada, some of these other ideas relating to the domain of Ishvara and Jiva, relating to the particular roles ascribed to Maya and Avidya did not exist. So who we read basically, if we are reading people like Madhusudana Saraswati and Prakashananda, then we might find little different, but when we are kind of trying to not pay too much attention to those minute aspects, then philosophically, Ajativada is the closest form for Dristisristi, and both ideas, like also where we find the concept in the term, including terminology of Dristisristi, is in the Yoga Vasishta, and Yoga Vasishta extensively cites, uses Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika, where Ajativada is established. So they are very much similar or close.
Professor, there's a question from Rodrigo. It seems that for pedagogy to exist, ignorance is absolutely necessary. Is then ignorance a play of consciousness on itself for the sake of self-knowledge?
If we assume that hypothesis, then we are interpreting consciousness along the lines of Trikashaivism. I have no objection to that. From the Advaita, at least from the perspective of Shankaracharya, it is not that consciousness wants or has desire or to assume the manifold, to play as being many or come to the world. It's like because there is no Ishitritva, there is no will in the Brahman. Brahman does not have any ichha inherent to it, because in one of the conversations we had, Swamiji and I had that issue discussed. So we will be switching a little bit, not like a big leap, philosophically should not matter, but we'll be stepping out of the boundaries of the Advaita of Shankara.
We have a question from Swamiji himself. What is Drishti Eka Srishti and Drishti Samakalina Srishti?
Oh, Swamiji, thank you for giving me this opportunity, because I was jumping everywhere. And Drishti Eva Srishti, when we say Drishti itself is Srishti, there are two meanings even there. Drishti as my perception, or Drishti as pure consciousness. What is creation? What is this world? What is this cup with tea in it? One, my perception, calling it a cup, and then the tea. These are all my language, my concepts imposed on something there. It is my drishti, my vision, because if we invite an elephant and say, dear elephant, this is a cup of tea for you. No, there is no concept for tea and the cups and the glasses for the elephant. So he would accept the object as object. He would still see the glass as the glass and water as water. May not call those. When we are naming, then we are giving drishti, perception, our imposition. That would be one understanding. Another would be drishti as pure consciousness. Even when I am seeing this as water or tea or cup or glass or whatever I'm saying, even then, even in these modifications, consciousness as such is not modified, and it is still in its own pristine form. The very true consciousness is still there. That is drishti eva srishti in two different types of understandings. And another is Dristi Samakalina Srishti, and this is a lower type of interpretation because this is only contemporaneous to perception that, like Prakashananda brings this example of the dream snakes. Like Shashank and I are meeting Swamiji, and Shashank, I see he's telling Swamiji, last night I had this really frightening dream. I had this snake, and then I'm like, wait a minute, I also dreamt of a snake. Can you describe your snake? No, it was giant, long python kind of thing. I said, no, are you kidding? I mean, it was not. So, and then we come, Swamiji, you see, we dreamt the same snake. But did we actually dream the snake? Is the snake in our dreams identical? Because, all the descriptions match completely, but it is only in the dream. If there were like a real actual snake we saw, then we could argue that what we saw was the same snake, but because it was in a dream. Samakalina, that dream creature was only contemporaneous to the dream, and that dream is only contemporaneous to the dreaming subject. The moment dreaming subject doesn't exist, then the dream object doesn't exist either. Therefore, any comparison or identity, or no, wait a minute, your snake was black, mine was not so black. It has patterns. Therefore, we had two different types, almost identical, but two different snakes. Doesn't make sense. It is also just like identity is silly, difference is also silly. The same way, the Samakalina, only for the moment that we are seeing, then we have this creation. Afterward, making any assumption regarding that object is not there because it doesn't even exist. The dream snake doesn't exist when we wake up. So that would be Dristi Samakalina Srishti. Thank you, Swamiji.
There is a question from Nitin. Can't there be Aneka Jiva Dristisristivada?
Absolutely. Therefore, Madhusudana Saraswati does not identify Drishti, Srishti, and Ekajiva. He kind of sort of treats them in two different chapters. When there is a Ekajiva, then it is Jiva's perception itself is creation, then it looks automatically a Drishti, Srishti. But then there can be, what happens to multiple subjects perceiving things and constituting their reality. You create your reality, I create my reality. But to what extent your reality trumps over, there again, when we have multiple jivas, then we have to go to Ishvara, because then there is this some type of base external reality that is constituted by Ishvara, upon which we project our own reality. Like you have, you put $10 on table and ask your kids what is the best thing they can do with it, and then they are free to create the utility of that $10. But that $10, let's say, is God's creation, and how many ways we find a good expense of spending that 10 is individual's creation. Therefore, we do create individually. And there is always, even in multiple jivas, there is this individual creation, and sometimes we fail to, go out of the boundary of individual's creation, and then we might, from the multiple jivas creation perspective, then we have to accommodate to what extent one jiva is creating. But why do we see the same thing? From the multiple jiva perspective, same thing is just an illusion. Identity is just an illusion. And because of me and you sharing the same karma, we see same thing. And if there are people with completely different karma, they are going to see different thing, even on the same substrate. Like, for example, when I'm walking through the grass, and if I'm giving dog a walk, and then the dog, going to sniff and maybe pee on that grass. So his perception towards grass is very different than if I have a goat and giving my goat a walk, and then his perception towards grass is going to be very different. So every jiva has his karma, and based on his karma, he's going to see differently. And when we have the same response, It is not because the object is identical, but because we share the same karma. Therefore, our response is identical. We are reacting in exactly identical way, not because the thing is identical, but because we have the exact identical karma or homogeneous karma. That would be from the perspective of multiple jivas.
Thank you, Professor. The last question about practice. How does one practice Dristisristi or Advaita doctrines in empirically awake life, especially when faced with unpleasant situations?
That part I do not even know, because the practice here is about having these ideas and playing these ideas again and again in the mind. But when it comes to practice, if I go to Gaudapada, for example, Gaudapada's, at least, I mean, historians might disagree, but we have Srividya practice text attributed to Gaudapada also, but at least Prakashananda, Madhusudana. When it comes to practice, my own Guruji, Shankara Chaitanya Bharati, and many other Gurujis I had who were foremost Vedanta practitioners and were also equally Tantric practitioners. So Vedanta is something you have like a Shambhava Upaya in the Trika system, for example. This is the playing with the ideas. And then in terms of actual kind of gradual things to do, visualizations and all, I don't think there is a point of repeating. It might happen, magic might occur. Thou art that, something keep repeating, but I find that funny.
So, Professor, thank you. On behalf of everybody on this call, thank you so much. And I would venture to say that you've left a lot of people with many things to think about and probably more questions. But unfortunately, we don't have all night, unfortunately, or all day. But anyway, thank you again on behalf of everybody. And namaskar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Swamiji.